All right, the second part of all things Russia that we need to look at are the variety of political institutions that exist in Russia. We'll talk about elements of the government. We'll talk a little bit about political parties. We'll talk about interest groups and other entities that influence politics in Russia. So if we talk about the political structure in Russia, in 1993, like I said in the first set of notes, that there was a constitution that was established, and it established Russia's democracy, but there's a history of authoritarianism that we'll kind of highlight throughout this set of notes and the next set of notes. Russia is considered a hybrid regime that uses either soft authoritarianism or gets described as semi-authoritarian. When we talk about soft authoritarianism, it's a system of political control in which a combination of formal and informal mechanisms ensure the dominance of a ruling group or party, despite the existence of some forms of political competition and expressions of political opposition. So we could talk about the party system in Russia as kind of being a one-party dominant system where one party stays dominant, that other people are allowed to compete, but it's like, Lucy pulling the football away from Charlie Brown every time an election comes, that it looks like a challenger could rise, could potentially win, and unseat the dominant party, but something happens at the last minute to create things differently, or that it changes the political landscape. If we wanted to talk about it as semi-authoritarian, it would be talking about it as a system where there are democratic elements integrated into an authoritarian system. So you could use either of these terms, or you could definitely call it an illiberal democracy as well, because there are, like I said, democratic trends or elements, but they all don't function in a way that we expect democracies to function. They have a federal system, but they are an asymmetric federal system, which means that power is not necessarily distributed equitably. So according to the Constitution, there are 85 regions or subnational units that kind of function in a way slightly similar to states, where there are places like Crimea, which, we're hearing people still talk about today, where places can be annexed, right? That when that these places all have guaranteed representation in the national legislature, in the Federation Council, but they have different levels of power. There are 21 ethnically non-Russian republics, and they have some greater or lesser powers than others, and I know that was a little choppy because I got lost in how small some of my notes are, but we'll kind of look at how this plays a little bit over the next couple of slides. So Russia is also kind of chopped up into different mega regions that also have different kind of layers to the onion of how much power or influence that they have. There are 7 super districts that all have a governor that is run by a presidential appointee. So you'll see kind of these 7 super districts along the bottom, kind of chunked up by color. And the president has the ability to remove any governor who does not kind of uphold federal policies. So it'd be like, when Trump started talking about how he wanted to punish cities that use the designation as sanctuary cities, or you saw California recently in the news kick around the idea of becoming a sanctuary state that would ignore elements of federal immigration law. If we operated under a Russian system, then President Trump would have the ability to remove the governor of California from power for, openly disobeying federal policy. These districts have differing levels of authority or autonomy, and we'll talk about some of that a little bit more later. While it's asymmetric federalism, I would make the argument that they're treading unitary because not only are the people who are installed to be the governors of these 7 superregions kind of puppets of Putin, but most power is being taken away from local governments and kind of being vested mostly in the hands of Putin, a little bit in the Duma and or the Federation Council, the legislative branches. So it's more of a unitary relationship because the central government has disproportionately more power than anybody else. So if we want to talk about why these regions exist in theory, and we want to think of the question that shows up next to that first map, why do they use asymmetric federalism? First, it's to deal with kind of ethnic or regional cleavages, and we'll talk about the differences in all of those groups a little bit more in the next slideshow when we talk about citizen society and the state. Some places have the right to have their own language or constitution, and a lot of it was done in the 1993 Constitution because the central government was infinitely more weak than it is today. So you needed to have more independent authority to rule than maybe they need to have or are allowed to have today. When we talk about Putin's crackdown on autonomy, he's shutting down any form of dissent or resistance against his control. That if we talk about power vertical, it's Putin's push to create more executive power from that national level, that he has more say, right? So when I talk about the 7 super districts on the slides before this that are headed by a presidential appointee, that this is him playing out power vertical to give him new authority over just about every territory. In addition to the districts that are headed by presidential appointees of the different regions, none of them can elect their own governor. Now they are all nominated by the president and confirmed by a regional legislature. So now the president of Russia has the ability to control the governors of every individual territory, just like in our Constitution where the president has appointment power, he also has removal power. Like I said in a previous slide, he has the ability to remove individuals from office who do not adhere to decrees of Putin or of following national law. The other thing that he does to kind of eliminate regional autonomy is change how they have representation in the Federation Council, which is half of the Russian legislature. That governors are now able to appoint one individual to the Federation Council, and the regional legislature gets the other appointment, so individuals do not get to vote for who serves them in the Federation Council. It's almost like how the Senate operated in the United States before the constitutional amendment was passed that says senators are directly elected. The other thing that he did is he eliminated the single member district in the Duma, which is the equivalent of their House of Representatives, that it's all proportional now, and it changed he originally changed the threshold of having to win 7% of the vote to be able to be guaranteed a seat. And then he changed it again in 2016 to create a hybrid electoral system that has some members elected into the Duma through a single member district and some through proportional representation. That changed in 2016, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the slides on the Federation Council and the Duma. But understanding this in Russia will help make a little bit of sense of Mexico's hybrid electoral system, where they use both of these as well. If we want to talk about the governmental structure, they are definitely a semi-presidential system. where they use elements of both a parliamentary system and a presidential system. But like I said at the end of the first set of notes, the 1993 Constitution establishes a three-branch government: an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. The two bodies at the top, the Duma and the Federation Council, are both wings of the Russian legislative branch, and then the body at the bottom is the Constitutional Court, which is kind of their equivalent of the Supreme Court. In their semi-presidential system, their focus is on having a strong executive, that the president is the focus of power. If the president dies, there's no vice president. The head of government, who is the prime minister, will take over. The current head of state is Vladimir Putin. He's directly elected. He has to have a majority on a first ballot to be elected. If not, then the top two candidates from the first round of voting in a presidential election will show up on a final ballot. It's exactly the same system that's happening if you're following the French presidential election now. They are elected for a 6-year term. This changed in 2012. Before that, it was a 4-year term. So there's a limit of 2 consecutive terms, which kind of explains why Putin was the president from 2000 to 2008, and then was the prime minister from 2008 to 2012, that he found a loophole in the Constitution that says, right, you can't be the president for more than 2 consecutive terms. So he is president until 2018. That's when the next election is, in March of next year. And then if he wins, he can run for another 6-year term. Putin is definitely an interesting dude. You can find all kinds of sweet pictures of Putin in action across the internet. He loves to parade around without a shirt. He loves to play hockey on his birthday against a bunch of Russian all-stars, where he tends to win a lot. He's a judo champion. You can see him kissing dolphins. That he's just he feels like a Bond villain in terms of just looking at how kind of badass he is portrayed in the media. The powers of the president are to appoint the prime minister, to appoint the cabinet, and to appoint the governors of all of the 89 regions and the 7 super regions. The president has the power to issue decree that has the force of law, that these don't have legislative review, that in theory the Constitution says that a presidential decree cannot go against laws passed by the Duma, but as Putin has been in power, he has issued decrees that have done that. A presidential decree in Russia is like an American executive order on steroids that has way more of a force of law than a presidential executive order. He has the ability to dissolve the Duma, and that means he can dissolve the Duma if there's a vote of no confidence in the government, or they reject his proposed candidate for prime minister 3 times, but it's never been used under the Constitution of 1993. The president can be impeached, but both houses of the legislative body must agree. The Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court all need to agree to remove him, and given the number of presidential appointees into those bodies, that's virtually impossible to happen. If something were to happen and the president dies or becomes incapacitated, then the prime minister fills the post until new presidential elections can be held. So we saw this in 2000, right, where Yeltsin stepped down. Putin was the prime minister, becomes president only until there was a new presidential election where he was elected. So there's not a presidential succession order like there is in the United States, that if something happened to Trump, then Pence became the president until the next election, and Pence would get to approve a vice president. Here, the prime minister stays president until an election can be held, and then there's a new president who can appoint a new prime minister. The prime minister is the head of government. It's currently Dmitry Medvedev, who is the Russian president from 2008 to 2012. He is essentially in charge of the Duma, and he can be removed from office if there are 2 repeat votes of no confidence within a 3-month period. So, if we wanted to look at what features make it a presidential system and what makes it parliamentary, it's a presidential system because there's a president, there's a fixed electoral cycle, the president has the ability to veto actions of the Duma, and the president may be impeached. All features, standard features of a presidential system. It's parliamentary because it's split, that the prime minister becomes the head of government, that they have authority over the legislature that, like, our vice president doesn't have, and that there are votes of no confidence that can dissolve the legislative branch, which is something that doesn't happen in a presidential system. Alright, if we want to talk about their legislature, they do have a bicameral legislature. It's split into the Duma and the Federation Council. The Duma is dubbed the lower house. It's currently 450 members, and you think the representation of women in the United States is low. In Russia, we have seen a massive decline in the number of women who are elected and represented in the State Duma. In 1984, about 33% of the Supreme Soviet legislature were women. As of 2010, it's 13, and I think it held around there in recent elections. Women are not the only group. The working class is also massively underrepresented, that the bulk of the deputies in the Duma are kind of white male elites at a rate as high or higher than a lot of other countries throughout the world. Their electoral system has kind of changed a couple of times in recent history, that in 2007, up to 2007, it was single-member districts. It then became proportional in 2007, and then it changed again in 2016 to have half of the 450 are chosen from a closed list proportional representation system, and then half of them are chosen by single member districts. In 2011, everybody was eligible for a 4-year term. After that, it changed to 5-year terms for the State Duma. And these individuals are granted immunity from criminal prosecution, so this is why you see corruption allegations run rampant, that if people are kind of implicated in a crime, they have essentially legislative immunity. In terms of powers that they pass bills, they approve the budget, and they confirm the appointments of the president, but their powers are limited, part and parcel because of the ability of presidential decree, that, right, constitutionally it can't overrule actions of the Duma, but realistically they do. The Duma, right, has the ability to impeach or reject a prime minister, but those have failed, given some of these manipulations of the electoral system to guarantee that there's a majority party, and they have the power to impeach the president, but because all 4 elements of the legislative and judicial bodies have to all agree to remove the president, it's virtually impossible for them to be able to do that. The Federation Council is the upper house. It represents the regions. There are 2 members from each of the 85 federal sub-districts, so it's 170 members. One is chosen by the governor of each region, and then the other representative is chosen by the regional legislature. This was selected or changed under Putin, where originally the governors were on the Federation Council as well. And remember that this is not a popularly elected check because the president is the one who gets to appoint the governor. When you talk about powers that they have, not a lot. That they have the ability to delay bills, um, much like the House of Lords does in the UK. They can be overridden by the Duma with a two-thirds vote. They have the ability to also approve presidential appointees like the Duma does. They can approve presidential decrees that relate to martial law and, state emergencies, which, they tend to rubber stamp the president since they, at least half of the body is people who are rubber stamped by the president as well. They also have the ability to change boundaries among the republics, to ratify the use of armed forces, and to appoint and remove judges. And that last part is kind of their unique power that they have that the Duma does not. If we want to talk about identifying a legislative process in Russia, here's how it kind of steps through the process. Either legislative chamber or the president can propose something. It then goes through the Duma, right? They consider things first. If it passes the Duma, it goes to the Federation Council. And if there's a difference between the two bodies, then there's a conciliation commission that will hammer out a final version of the bill, kind of similar to a conference committee between like the House and the Senate in the United States. If we want to talk about the judiciary, there is a constitutional court that is 19 members. They are all appointed by the president. They are all approved by the Federation Council. They do have the power of judicial review, but they don't use it very often because they try to not confront the president. So it becomes a question of whether or not the judiciary is truly independent from the executive branch. Their job in the Constitutional Court is to resolve conflicts regarding kind of the constitutionality of a bunch of different laws or disputes between institutions. They can be forced to look at a case at either the request of the president, or if a citizen measure or 1/5 of either house votes to kind of push something onto their radar, they have to look at it. The problem with the Constitutional Court is that most of the prosecutors and attorneys are still kind of trained from the old trappings of the old Soviet legal system, which is kind of different from the Constitution of 1993, so there's not a lot of expertise in law. Putin also moved the Constitutional Court away from Moscow to Supreme Court or to St. Petersburg, and a lot of people make the argument that this was to create the signal that they were independent from the presidency. But more people are writing and making the argument that their move to St. Petersburg was to kind of remove them from being powerful or influential. So their Constitutional Court functions in the way that our United States Supreme Court does. Their Supreme Court is functionally the highest appellate court in the land, where it's the final court of appeals for civil and criminal cases, kind of like the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom, and it also lacks a power of judicial review. If we talk about rule of law, Putin initiated a legal reform of calling for jury trials, but there's still not this notion of innocent until proven guilty that, if you are tried of a crime, you're probably seen as guilty. A lot of momentum towards maintaining a consistent rule of law tends to be blocked by corruption at all levels, because there are security police that operate kind of outside of the auspices of the law. The oligarchs who have been put on trial, which we will talk about again at the latter end of this slideshow, these people are being convicted in show trials of corruption, to kind of remove Putin's political opponents. So these trials kind of show that the courts are not independent. They are not kind of on their quest of justice, that they are used by the president to weed out political opposition. There are corruption surveys that get circulated around. If we talk about like the CPI from Transparency International, looking at these surveys, at least half of the population is identified as being involved in under corrupt practices on a daily basis. That people are, bribing for a litany of different things. That they're doing it for permits, they're doing it to get in schools, to get favorable court rulings. That, the best way to get your way in Russia is to pay someone off. The military falls under the umbrella of political institutions, that they were the source of strength during the Cold War. They've been historically weak and not seen as much of a force until like the invasion of Ukraine. That some of this we saw in 2008 with their lightning war against Georgia, not Georgia in the south, but the old Russian territory of Georgia, where they rolled in to show force to punish kind of a U.S. ally, to kind of show that they will control their turf. Their ability to kind of go in and deal with the entire conflict in Crimea has kind of shown a little bit of their strength or their prominence. They're starting to kind of saber rattle again, so maybe we're seeing a resurgence of the military. In terms of the military, there's universal male conscription. In 2008, it was reduced from 2 years of mandatory service to 1. They still do have a professional, military that you can sign up for life service if you want to. And that will be the standing military. In 2013, the Russian defense minister said that they will still utilize these people who are, universal conscripts into military service, that they will not be used in combat roles unless they ultimately have to be. There's also the FSS. The FSS is the Federal Security System. It's the successor to the KGB, which was the Russian CIA under the Soviet Union. And the FSS has kind of increased their power under Putin. And the answers to this is because Putin is a former KGB operative, that a lot of his staff have come from this arena as well, that when the military struggled to, deal with Chechnya in the late 90s, early 2000s, that they wanted to increase, the FSS. And you've seen, a lot of accusations that, some of the prominent Russians who have mysteriously died in recent history have done so because of the FSS kind of offing people who were critical of Putin. A good example of this is Alexander Litvinenko, who was a critic who took asylum in the United Kingdom and then was magically poisoned with, I think it was like polonium, which is primarily only found in Russia. And you've seen a couple of recent prominent individuals who have been kind of killed in recent fashion, and people believe that the Russian government is still actively assassinating people who are kind of outspoken critics of Putin.